Hello and welcome to a festive episode of Unstratified Entertainment. Today I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, in the series that's all about entertainment. We like to look at film, TV, and other forms of media and examine how it relates to history, both our knowledge of history, a broader context of history, and also as well how it works as entertainment. It's not just about, I think, being historically accurate. It's about the quality and the spirit of whatever it is that's being made and how it sits with us. That's what this show is about. And today we figured we'd give ourselves a festive treat and move away from controversial topics such as a bypass tunnel being dug in Salisbury Plain towards something completely uncontroversial, completely uh, uh, unlikely to get the blood pumping, and that is the topic of the princes in the tower. Now,
And as our viewer can see, you've got your festive headgear on. I'm proving my credentials as a serious historian and archaeologist. I've
uh-huh.
got my medieval hat, my 15th century hat,
Mm-hmm.
complete with a swan's feather,
Mm-hmm.
and you see the Plantagenet leopard there on the side
Oh
to show
yes,
my allegiance to the monarchy.
I like it.
It's not it's not 3 lions on the shirt. It's 3 Plantagenet leopards.
Leopards, interesting,
Yeah,
interesting. That would be a far less catchy song, though, wouldn't it?
it wouldn't scan as well.
No,
No.
three leopard. No, no. So this is all about Richard III, and this is also all about Philippa Langley. Now, people may know that name. She is the historian who pushed for, helped to fund, and was very prominent in the uncovering, the rediscovery of King Richard III's remains in a car park in Leicester. The King in the Car Park documentary actually can also still be found on More 4 on the Channel 4 app, where I watched this documentary a couple of days ago. And she well, yeah, the premise is laid out whereby it was thought that she considered job done when Richard III was found. We found him again. We've given him a proper burial. Job done. But actually, she said that the job wasn't done, and there was still the question as to whether or not Richard had actually done or commissioned the deed, the murder of his nephews, a threat to his legitimacy as king, in the Tower of London. This is part of national history. It's a historical narrative that many people are familiar with. And even when I lived in York, as much as I'm not familiar with that period of history in particular detail, there is a Richard III, or was, I don't know if it's still there post-COVID, Richard III museum in a gatehouse in the city, which was an interesting little visit as well. So people often, when they hear about this story, they become very passionate. They have strong opinions, and Philippa is certainly possessed of passion and opinion. She's a member of the Richard III Society, and these Ricardians spend a lot of their time researching the period and combating what is often described as, to use terminology that they often deploy, Tudor propaganda. That is to say, the accepted story of history is not seen to them as one that is untouched by the likes of Henry Tudor and co. So, uh, where, I mean, do we need to know a little bit more about the princes in the tower in order to know what on earth's going on with this documentary?
Yeah, I think if I just lay out the basics of the story as it's more generally understood, and it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting you mentioned York there.
Mm.
Richard's power base was in the north of England and Yorkshire. He had a castle at Middleham in Yorkshire, and in fact, if you go to York Minster, off to one side in one of the, but in a prestigious position, is
Mm.
a rather sad little tomb, which is actually of Richard III's young son,
Right.
who died at Middleham Castle in I think 1484, while when not long after Richard had become king,
Mm.
and was one of the reasons why Richard was so insecure, because his heir, the person who would have become king when he died, had themselves died first,
Right.
which meant that Richard was a king with no heir at that point, which made it much easier for pretenders like Henry Tudor to take a tilt at the throne. Essentially, the story is this. Richard was one of a group of extremely charismatic, highly successful brothers who were the son of the Duke of York, who had kicked off the Wars of the Roses, if anybody knows their Shakespeare and Henry VI. Their father had been killed as a result of losing a battle in the Wars of the Roses. His elder brother Edward is this big giant of a blonde hero, charismatic man, had become king, was exiled when the Lancastrians made a comeback, beat them, came back, reigned as king, and married a lady called Elizabeth Woodville. Bringing the so-called Woodville faction to court. Edward died suddenly in 1483. Leaving as the new king, he and Elizabeth's son, Edward, who would become automatically under the rules of succession, the moment his father died, he became King Edward V. And they were out of town at the time. Cutting to the chase, in the early summer of 1483, the young king was being brought to London to be crowned by members of the Woodville faction, as they're called. And Richard, for reasons which people still argue about, including the Richard III Society, who was to be named as Lord Protector while the king reigned in his minority before he became 18, was basically staged, for want of a better word, a coup at Stony Stratford in the Midlands. He met the royal party, arrested the Woodvilles, and took the king into his, quote, protection, and took him to London. Then, as the preparations for the king's coronation were being made, it was suddenly announced that Edward IV had in fact entered into what was called a pre-contract of marriage. And that meant, under medieval canon law and church and English laws of succession, that a pre-contract with Lady Eleanor Butler was effectively counted as a marriage, which meant that his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous, and therefore the children were bastards, illegitimate.
Right, I see.
So now, again, people argue about where that pre-contract, how genuine that pre-contract was. It was certainly very convenient timing, because what happened next was that Richard announced tearfully, sadly, that this was the situation, and therefore,
sadly, I must become king.
Absolutely. So, tragically, for all concerned, Richard, the coronation preparations became coronation preparations not for Edward V, but for Richard III. That left Richard with the issue of what to do with the boys. Now, the Ricardians argued they were now no longer any danger. They were declared illegitimate under law. They couldn't come back. Other people argue, yeah, you could, as the current UK government is finding, you can change the law one way, but then somebody can always change it back. So, and it would only take the Pope to, an appeal to the Pope to say, actually, it was all right, and Edward really is the king. So, the traditional view is that the boys, first of all Edward, and then his younger brother Richard, were placed in the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. Contemporary sources are really important in this story, and really important to Philippa Langley's book and documentary. Contemporary sources refer to the two boys in what was then the palace of the Tower of London. It wasn't necessarily a prison. It wasn't necessarily somewhere you went to be executed or to wait to be quietly put away. It was somewhere where members of the royal family lodged when they were in London. It just happened to be a place that was more secure than perhaps other of the palaces. contemporary sources refer to the boys being seen in the grounds of the tower, to be playing, shooting bows and arrows, and so on. But it's then recorded that they were seen less and less until they were no longer seen at all. So the contemporary sources effectively say at some point in the late summer, early autumn of 1483, the boys disappeared. They were not seen again in any, at least put it this way. It is not in any way proven, shown that those two boys showed up anywhere else after the summer of 1483.
Right. Yes.
And in fact, as early 1484, the head of the État Général, the States General in France, the head of the French Parliament, was telling the story of the sad demise of the king of the young King of England as a cautionary tale to French nobility and politicians as to what could happen when you had a king in a minority. Who wasn't legally old enough to rule in their own right, because that was the situation France was in at the time as well. So within a few months of them disappearing, it was being stated that they'd been killed.
Right.
Now, jump forward to August of 1485. Richard is killed at the Battle of Bosworth. He is famously, as Philippa Langley, the work partly directed and funded by Philippa Langley, the Richard III Society, showed in 2012, carried out by the Leicester Archaeologists and the DNA team under Terry King and at the University of Leicester. Richard, who did have a back condition, scoliosis, but which wouldn't have affected his day-to-day life apart from possibly causing him some physical discomfort, pain. But he could function perfectly well as a medieval warrior and king. But what his death didn't lead to was a revelation of what had happened to the princes. They basically had vanished, and there were no bodies. Now, that famous concept in English law is habeas corpus: show us the body. And there were no bodies to share here. And even Henry VII, the new king, the pretender Henry Tudor, who led the rebellion, ultimately successful rebellion, did not accuse Richard of the murder of Edward and Richard in his legislation on becoming king. The closest he got was a reference to child murder without naming anybody. And so that fact that there were no bodies and that Henry made no accusation had led some Ricardians, for example, to argue that actually he had a greater motive for offering the princes than Richard had. And if he found them alive when he became king, they wouldn't have lasted very long, because their claim to the crown was better than his. If they were seen as legitimate.
Yeah.
And of course they represented a different half of the Wars of the Roses. They were the Yorkist half, he was the Lancastrian half.
Yeah.
It then gets further complicated by the fact that to unite the country, Henry marries the boy's sister. To unite the two dynasties, and that's where we get the Tudor rose from, the white rose and the red rose united, although that doesn't come in as iconography until Henry VIII, really. She was still Elizabeth of York, and the mother of Henry VIII.
Yes.
So somebody who has skin in the game has, her brothers are the ones that disappeared. She's then presented with two pretenders, Lambert Simnel in 1487, and then through the 1490s, a second pretender called Perkin, who is known to history as Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be the younger boy Richard, although some historians now argue that the Lambert Simnel rebellion was actually in the name of, and this is covered in the documentary, was actually in the name of Edward V, and that Edward survived and was actually there in 1487 at the Battle of Stoke, where the rebellion was defeated, and may even have been killed at the Battle of Stoke, buried anonymously. after the battle. So that's the history that lies behind the documentary. The traditional story really begins in the 15 teens, 1520s, when Sir Thomas More's History of Richard III is written and later published, which lays down the traditional story, which was then picked up by Shakespeare, that the king, appropriately enough, seated on the privy, particularly sort of disgusting and base way to come up with a disgusting and base action, sends some of his henchmen to the tower to murder the princes. The princes are murdered by smothering in their beds, suffocated. They're then, as Moore describes it, buried under a staircase, 10 feet under a staircase in the Tower of London, in the White Tower. And although then it's later suggested that they were exhumed and the bodies were removed elsewhere, another complication. Shakespeare picks up the story in the 1590s and writes this fantastic satire on politics and Machiavellian princes called Richard III, the tragical history of Richard III, and that really fixes the idea of the humpback, the distorted in body, distorted in mind super villain who is also incredibly articulate and compelling. And that fixes the public view. And the final piece of evidence that's covered, that people might be aware of, in the 1580s, when Charles II has just become king again, there is work being done in the Tower of London. Bones are discovered, including 2 skulls, which appear to be of 2 children. Now, there's no chain of evidence, but after a period of time, the king ordered the bones collected because they were seen as being likely to be those of the princes, and they were placed in a highly decorative marble monument designed by Sir Christopher Wren in Westminster Abbey. And they were, along with a basic outline of the history, and they are given their identities as King Edward V and his brother Richard. And that monument is still there to be visited. When you visit, it is in the royal section of Westminster Abbey. It's in a prominent position. It's a position of honour. The contents were examined in the 1930s, and we'll maybe come back to that later, which is something Ricardians make a lot of, because it was an inconclusive examination, including by somebody who had no medical experience. And subsequent requests, particularly after the DNA work that was done that identified Richard III conclusively, requests to have the contents of that monument examined again was certainly refused by the late Queen, who apparently said, "Let them rest in peace." Now, it is hoped by some supporters of Richard III that the new king, particularly this interest in history and archaeology, might relent and allow for a fresh examination, and particularly DNA work on those skeletons. So that's really where the story stands at the moment, and that's where Philippa Langley picks up the history.
Well, and it's a very tenuous place to be, isn't it? Because if that DNA work is done and it's shown to be the boys, then all of this goes out the window. So it's right there on a knife's edge. And so for now, claims can be made and can't be disproven, I suppose, adequately.
Yes.
Now, interestingly, at the beginning of the documentary, she says that for her, she feels very strongly, quote, very strongly, that the truth matters, and therefore set up the Missing Princes project, involving, as described in the documentary, an army of researchers from around the world who've been making startling discoveries, in particular across the European continent. And that does make sense. As they lay it out in the documentary, it makes perfect sense, because you might be able to rewrite domestic history and destroy and or modify documentation and future copies of documents within the UK, or within England in particular. But doing that in other kingdoms across the continent is much more difficult for the fledgling Tudor dynasty. And to this end, and I made a note here, which I found interesting, asking why is it that she goes and finds the TV personality Judge Rinder, who is a barrister. Is he a KC?
Rob Rinder KC,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. He is a practicing King's Counsel.
Hmm.
He, amongst other things, he's taken part in trials relating to fraud in Caribbean countries,
Hmm.
alleged fraud in Caribbean countries, and so on. So you know,
And also murder
he's
cases. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, you know,
Mm.
he's got a genuine legal career, and he's used to handling evidence and particularly assessing documents.
Mm. Well, this and just for folks outside the UK, he's Judge Rinder in the same way that you also have Judge Judy in the US. He has that sort of TV role as well.
Far,
But
far be it from me to say that the onlyism television believes in is plagiarism, but basically, the Judge Rinder program is it is sort of adjacent to the format of Judge Judy.
yes,
Sure is.
exactly. But anyway, so she says that she approaches him because, quote, she needed a criminal forensic mind. She also refers to him as a professional skeptic to open this cold case investigation. And the whole documentary, I don't know about the book, but the documentary is certainly framed as a reopening of a cold case and an attempt to demonstrate to a legal professional beyond reasonable doubt their case that the boys survived Richard III and indeed continued to push their claim for the throne of England. Now, it's interesting that that everything here, if seeing as you can't disprove some of these claims until that DNA evidence is examined, everything is based upon the documentation that they can uncover, and also as well the likelihood that documentation is acceptable. So there are some experts who are brought in to comment on this throughout the documentary. And one of the early experts that's brought in is Janina Ramirez of Oxford University,
Yeah.
who is an early medieval art specialist. And she dismisses, for example, Thomas More's account and also the account of Mancini, an Italian monk priest who was in London at the time and commented on how the boys were seen less and less frequently until eventually they just weren't seen at all.
Indeed, yes.
She dismisses them out of hand and goes so far as to say, "This is a Catholic nation. You don't kill children." Now,
Has she studied? Has she studied Renaissance Italy?
that's my point exactly. Yeah. Does she know the Borgia? You know, like does she know? Does she know anything about the and and I don't mean that to dismiss her, but
No, no. She's a serious academic.
yeah, but I am
You know,
fascinated as to how and why it is that she is the academic that they use on this TV show. She's known for appearing in various documentaries, but she is not a period specialist. So it is interesting, an interesting use of her. What do you make of that from a production standpoint?
I think the production of this is really interesting, and it's worth also mentioning that the talking heads in general. Another talking head is used. I've just told the traditional version in outline, and the documentary does exactly the same thing. It uses a historian called Nathan Amin, who's a Welsh specialist in the period. He's about to publish a book called The Son of Prophecy about Henry Tudor, became Henry VII, and his family origins. He described himself on his ex-Twitter account as a Tudor propagandist, fellow of the Royal Historical Society, author of the House of Beaufort and Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders. And that's the particular one. Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders is he looks at exactly the same story arc as Philippa Langley does, but Amin's used to tell the traditional version. And in fact, in an interview, he described how during the making of the film, he did a couple of takes involving the narrative. I think it was actually shot at the Tower of London, if I remember correctly. And he tells the traditional version, and he tells the story that the director of the program then said, "Look, it was a bit hedged around and academic, and the evidence points to the fact that Richard could have da da da. Could you just not say that Richard did it?"
Yeah.
And he then goes on to say, okay, and he makes another piece to camera saying that Richard did it. And in an interview he's given about this whole subject, he talks about that and that moment, and how people should understand that television isn't made for historians; it's made for a TV audience, and that that the historian doesn't have the last word. The TV director and producers do. And that is absolutely true. I can say, I think I said to you while we were setting this up, I had exactly the same experience when we were making the film about the Burma Spitfires, and that we'd have situations where I'd do a take and the director would say, "Yeah, Andy, that was great, but could we do another take?" And I need you to say, and it takes at that point you have a choice to make. You just say, "Okay, can I just say that? Is it ethically okay to say that?" Or do I have to say, look, I can't say that, but what I could say is. So you're meeting halfway, you're trying to come to a compromise. That's how TV production like this works. It's not like a peer review paragraph in a journal of record.
No.
We've seen how flaky that can be recently.
No.
You see what I mean? So people need to be aware of this, and that this may have gone on in some of the pieces, some of what you see on screen. You don't see how they were set up.
No, this is true. But that said, though, in that sense, it's possibly even worse in terms of representation of history, potentially, than The Lost King was, because this does not have its fiction defense. Lots of the stuff we talked about in our conversation about The Lost King, you were playing the role at times of saying, well, yeah, but it's writing, it's a story structure. There's a reason for this.
It's what Shakespeare did.
Yes, but in this instance, while it is what the documentary crew apparently did, that's not how it's presented. It's not presented as a fictional story. It's presented as a serious presentation to a serious legal mind on the legality, on balance of as Rinder puts it, proof of life for the boys from the tower. And I made a note here that said here that the more the so-called mainstream, and they use the term mainstream history in this documentary, versus interested amateur narratives persist, the more damaging they are in terms of debate and trust. And I would say the reason why they're potentially more damaging is not because alternate views are unwelcome. Alternate views with evidence can be fascinating. But alternate views presented in what is technically bad faith, i.e., a director putting words into the mouth of an academic.
Not putting words into the mouth of an academic. Asking an academic to state a particular viewpoint
because it would be better for the arc of the story. It supports
the narrative arc of their program.
Exactly. And therefore putting words into his mouth. The guy did the take, and the director said, "I don't like that. Let's change it." So, in a very narrow sense, suggesting words for the mouth of the historian involved, that doesn't help, especially when it is presented as being a serious documentary in this notion of what a debate is and what we can trust within those debates surrounding these things. Now, one of the first pieces of evidence that we see in the show is a receipt found in Lille in France, and it's a receipt for 400 pikes. Written in 1487, supposedly for use in a Yorkist invasion of England, led by an impostor, possibly backed by King Maximilian of the Holy Roman Empire. Now that's the Tudor propagandists' angle, but this is a piece of evidence that the Ricardians Philip Langley brings Rob Rinder to as an opening gambit in showing that there was at least someone on the continent who believed that there was a surviving heir from the Yorkist house that could be backed in invading the country. What do you make of it? It's written by an accountant, and it also references Margaret of Burgundy as well.
Yes,
who was one of the sisters of Richard III, I think.
That yes, I need to this European aspect, and you alluded to it before, and we can. I think this is the moment to to be clear about this now. And this is something, again, I'm indebted to my late friend and colleague Mike Ingram, who did a lot of work on this particular aspect of the Wars of the Roses and the military aspect of the Wars of the Roses. And what Mike was always pointing out was that the English nobility at this time was not insular. It had relationships across Europe. It went on tours. It joined crusades. It joined, it served with other people's armies. It went on pilgrimage.
Yes.
Yeah, it went on pilgrimage and so on. And in fact, Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, was a sister of Edward IV and Richard III, and a very important player in European politics in her own right.
Yes.
And she backed politically and financially both the Lambert Simnel rebellion and the Perkin Warbeck attempted rebellion. And one of the arguments goes, why would she stick her neck out to that degree, financially, politically, roping in the the King of the Holy Roman Empire, soon to be the Emperor, Maximilian, a major figure in late medieval politics? Why would she commit all of that time and treasure for a no-hope son of a lower middle-class person from Oxford, or the son of a boat maker a fisherman, a boatman, or some from what's now Belgium? Did she? And this has gone into later on in the documentary. That allegedly at one of her palaces there was a Richard's room, as though it had been named for her nephew.
And more to the point, named for its occupant.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, being her nephew. We'll come to that maybe later in another one of the perhaps the most significant of the documents, or at least the most eye-catching of the documents. In defense of Janina Ramirez, although she doesn't need me to defend her, but she is quoted again in the publisher's blurb of the book as saying, quote, rather than favour Tudor propaganda or Victorian revisionism, the princes in the Tower asked us to go back to the time and scrutinise the evidence with fresh eyes. And in fact, even some negative reviews of the book that I've read say that Philippa Langley has actually done the study of the period of service by going back to the period documents and looking at them in a timeline, saying this document was done contemporaneously with the boys disappearing. This was done in the first few years after they disappeared, when the Lambert Simnel rebellion was being prepared. And this material relates to the Perkin Warbeck period down to the late 1490s. And then this is written a generation later, 2 generations later, it's being reported 3 generations later, etc., etc., etc. And that is really valuable. There's that rule of thumb in history, is that the closer you get to the event, the more likely your source material, your primary source material, is to be valuable. Because the moment it's transmitted through time or through third parties, it starts to be diluted.
Yes. Yeah.
Bits get lost, bits get left out, bits get misunderstood, spellings change. All that stuff happens that historians understand. But so if nothing else, what this film does, and what Langley has done in the book apparently, is to go back to your sources, guys.
Yeah.
And sorry, go on.
Well, which is excellent, and again, it should be clear, hopefully, in our previous discussion about Philippa Langley's work, that she does do great work. She does do solid work. She's not an unserious historian, and it's the stuff around it that sometimes can rub archaeologists and historians slightly the wrong way. And
it's worth making the point as well that people who have endorsed various conspiracy theories that stretch the evidence further and further and further, who are associated with the Ricardian cause and the Richard III Society and so on, which they don't go into in this documentary, but they are there, and they do, in a sense, give the study of the period a bad name and make people maybe less likely to comment on it than they might do otherwise if they're coming from a purely academic point of view.
And maybe that's why an early medieval art historian is one of the academics that they could get onto this documentary, in so much as Janina Ramirez is unlikely to lose too much face over stating an opinion on these documents, as opposed to presenting it as her research or something along those lines.
Absolutely, and also, Nathan Amin, he has his particular place in that particular, that particular field. He's respected. His books are respected, and but he, as I say, he's not coming from a purely academic point of view, but he's a professional writer.
No,
but he's writing solid work. The other people who appear in the one of the other people who appear on the in the documentary, Matthew Lewis, is associated with that. I think he's the current chair of the Richard III Society. But he's written a book which is about to go into a new edition, in fact, called "The Survival of the Princes in the Tower."
right.
I think it went to press before Philippa Langley's, but they follow, broadly speaking, the same trajectory in terms of wanting to bring fresh eyes to Richard and maybe to rehabilitate his reputation.
Well, and I suppose one final note on that is that that's not typically how historians work, though. That's the other thing that possibly bothers some historians, is that you don't typically set out to rehabilitate anyone. You set out to examine what documents say. And the funny thing is, that is exactly what they are doing. They are doing that. It's just that they're doing that with a slight a priori suggestion that perhaps the documents will say what they hope they will say.
Yeah. Now, getting back just very, very, very quickly to the Lille receipt, that says to anybody who knows the period, that says a number of things. Obviously, prima facie, it says that a continental power was engaged in supporting a potential insurrection by somebody who was claiming to be the rightful king of England at that moment, and they were supporting them militarily. The reference to Pikes is interesting, because the kind of what Mike would have said is that the use of pikemen, the assigning a pikeman to that kind of operation at that time, shows that this was cutting edge military technology. This was the technology that had been used famously by the Swiss to beat the Burgundians, the Burgundian cavalry. The pike was the new weapon of choice if your enemy relied on heavy cavalry.
Yes,
because you could keep them. A long pike with a sharp pointy bit on the end could keep your knight at distance, where you could then get him off his horse, kill his horse, get him on the ground, as happened with Richard at Bosworth.
Yes, exactly.
So this is a major European power using state-of-the-art military technology to back a rebellion of an English against the English king.
Yeah. Now, Lambert Simnel, be he a real person or not, or Edward or not, went on to be crowned, it seems, in Dublin.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that a statement is made. Nobody would want to do that for someone called Lambert Simnel, a 10-year-old boy from Oxford. Except, I think they possibly would. Again, if we're talking about, and to be fair, Rinda in the documentary does point this out, there are reasons why some people would either want to try and pull off a forgery, I suppose, a human forgery, or would want to believe strongly, with all their hearts, believe that these boys didn't perish, that they were still around.
Well, don't forget the doppelganger is a trope in fiction as well. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm thinking immediately of Mark Twain's famous story that's been filmed many times, "The Prince and the Pauper."
Yeah.
The idea of the lost aristocrat, the lost king, or whatever, who suddenly comes back and is acclaimed. It's a trope across history.
Yeah. No,
So,
exactly.
And it fulfills all sorts of cultural and political needs among audiences.
Now, this bias continues from the Ricardian perspective. There are some other potential explanations for who this Lambert Simnel character was. He may have been another Yorkist Edward, and that is Edward, Earl of Warwick, and not Edward the Fifth of the Tower. But regardless, whoever this Edward character was, or this Lambert Simnel character was, he died at the Battle of Stoke in 1487. And the Ricardian bias, I think, comes into this when he says, and I think he answers his own question here within his statement. If you're a mercenary, would you follow a random boy called Lambert Simnel? Well, if you're a mercenary, you follow anyone who's got money. Like, like I think that itself it's a self-feeding potential bias there. It's presuming that, oh no, they're only going to follow a true heir to the crown.
Well, just a couple of things just quickly there. First of all, Lambert Simnel as the Earl of Warwick is one of those fringe conspiracy theories, because the Earl of Warwick was actually imprisoned, for want of a better word, in the Tower by Henry VII. And in fact, effectively never left the Tower and was executed at the same time as Perkin Warbeck.
Right.
Because it was alleged they attempted to escape together. They were both caught, they were both tried, and they were both executed. Interestingly, Warbeck was hanged as a commoner, whereas the Earl of Warwick was beheaded as an aristocrat. His is actually one of the saddest stories in the whole thing, and it's often overlooked. But there's very little doubt that he was actually in the Tower at the time. So the idea that it was the Earl of Warwick, yes, they might have said that to people in Dublin, because people in Dublin weren't in London, and communications being what they were at the time, it was very hard to prove otherwise. The other thing about the Battle of Stoke, Lambert Simnel traditionally was captured at the Battle of Stoke, and to humiliate him, to show he was a commoner and had no connection with the royal family, Henry famously put him to work in the royal kitchens as a scullery boy. In terms of the people who were actually calling the shots at the Battle of Stoke, the mercenaries who were involved were led by a mercenary captain called Martin Schwart, and they gave their money's worth, because they were some of the last people left standing on the battlefield, and in fact pretty much all of them were killed. They were professional to the last. So that's what's going on here.
And so I should say the story of Edward dies on that field, and this character Lambert Simnel is fully born into this notion of especially being magnanimously forgiven for rebellion and put to work in the kitchens.
Yes.
Now, what follows in terms of documentation, following on from this receipt in Lille, is a first-person document, supposedly, found in an archive, the Gelders archive in Amhem in the Netherlands. It's an interesting one. It's a document that reads like a first-person statement, as Rinder himself says. It reads like a witness statement. This happened to me. I saw this. This happened next. But it's of extremely unknown provenance. In fact, it's even in the archive's loose acquisitions collection, so they don't know where it came from or when. And although it seems to be from the correct dates, 1450 to 1500, they almost sort of brush over this in the documentary. That actually this document was previously discovered. A piece of additional dialogue, I think, was recorded, explaining that actually this document had initially been found in the mid-20th century, the 50s or 60s or thereabouts, and that it had been essentially dismissed back then as not a reliable document. What do you make of it? Because Rinder calls it a potential smoking gun of a document, and that's one of the key parts of this documentary going on, is whether or not we can rely on this first person statement, supposedly written by Richard the Younger, about how he was separated from his brother in the Tower. The Percy brothers, aristocracy, came to him and swore to protect him, and then took him abroad, and then he was taken around the continent, and eventually was even linked with an invasion fleet. It's an interesting document that says, and to be fair, as Yanina Ramirez says later on in the documentary, says almost everything that you would want it to say, and indeed even skips to the most pertinent points in the story, as to how you'd want it to be presented, as to what on earth happened to this boy if he didn't die in the Tower. What do you make of it, given that it's not, this isn't new evidence in that sense, it's just being freshly interrogated?
Well, this is as I say, it's their highlight discovery. It's and credit the Dutch historian who found it in, or
Mm.
at least refound it in the Dutch archive, the Gelderland archive. It's Natalie Newman Bleekendal. And my apologies if I got her pronunciation wrong there. But it's described as a 4-page semi-legal manuscript, a witness statement.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that's what it is. Now, the film makers to their credit, again, they did forensic work on the parchment it's written on, and the literary style and so on. It all stacks up for the second half of the 15th century,
Mm-hmm.
when it's purported to have been written.
Mm.
Now, at the same time, I have to point out that other contentious documents have passed forensic tests in the past, and then been found subsequently to be forgeries. And I'm thinking of things like the famous Vinland map.
Yes.
So you still you have to be careful. At the same time, on balance, at the moment, it's a genuine document. Rinder says it's proof of life. Yes, it is proof of life. It's proof of life of somebody called Richard of England. Yes, it's proof of life of somebody called Richard of England. What it isn't proof of life is that Richard of England is the Prince Richard who was imprisoned in the Tower of London and disappeared in the late summer, early autumn of 1483.
So it is a smoking gun document. As you say, it is a proof of life of someone. Someone had to write this thing, clearly. It's not conclusive proof, though. And therefore has to be weighed in balance with everything else that is being presented, and also that we know about the period. I mean, do you think it just reads as too good to be true? Because it's an extraordinary statement. But then again, I suppose this arguably was a royal heir in an extraordinary situation, and therefore the statement may well have been necessary for quasi-legal purposes, as they say.
That's the point. That's the point. I think, I mean, my biggest problem with the whole documentary is, and again, understanding how documentaries are made, and the fact that this one is an authored documentary, if you like. It's telling the story through Philippa Langley's research with her research team. It's still it's skeptical. It sets out to be skeptical, but not skeptical enough. For example, it doesn't pose the question like, Rinder is allowed to get away, or maybe was prompted to say, or agreed to say. We don't know, but he talks about it as a proof of life, and it's taken as a proof of life of Richard the Fourth, if his brother is indeed dead by this point. And it's not.
Well, it's not by most standards, I would suggest, because, for example, proof of life today is classically someone holding up a newspaper from that morning in a photograph. Yes. You can see who they are, etc. In this instance, obviously, a photograph wouldn't be possible, but you'd have to have a sample of handwriting or some other thing that connects the boy that went into the tower with this document and this statement, which has been written many years later. So it's compelling. It's pointing in a direction, but it's not conclusive, is it? In that sense,
no. And look, I mean, again, we don't want to have too many spoilers going perhaps into even more detail on what's actually said in the doc. But I think it's fair to say that, first of all the evidence pretty much is treated in this way. Genuine evidence, and even genuinely new evidence, like that Lille receipt, is pointed up, but then it's taken as only being representative of the case that Philippa Langley wants to make.
Well, okay, or
at least the documentary makers through Philippa Langley want to make.
Yeah.
However that relationship worked out when the program was being developed.
Okay, given that. Okay, we won't say any other specifics then. Maybe we will leave the third document out of it, out of our video. But what is worthwhile saying, though, is there's this presentational bias of the extent to which the evidence is unusual. So this third document has a seal attached to it that Philippa gets very excited about.
Yeah.
And she says, you just don't expect that stuff to survive, she says to Rinder over breakfast. You just don't expect to find that sort of thing, I think she says. Um, Except you do when you're studying medieval documents, especially official documents, mayoral documents,
Yeah.
town corporations, and especially royalty. They are laden with seals, and the seals are designed to survive because they are proof that the document is legitimate.
Yes.
So again, the presentation of some of this stuff is bigging up. It is emphasizing its singular uh, importance and the direction of travel towards a conclusion. And to what extent do you want to talk about the conclusion of this documentary? Because I think I'd like to talk about the way it was filmed, if not what was said.
Right. Well, I'll leave you to go into the details, but
Mm-hmm.
basically, it was a classic. It was a classic setup reveal in a room.
Mm.
Um, and look, the whole thing is, and again, I'm not going to criticise them for the format of the film. It's a police procedural, one of the most successful formats in the entire history of television. It's repeated and repeated and repeated because it
Mm-hmm.
works, because
Mm-hmm.
audiences love it. Time Team was a police procedural, as I've
Mm-hmm.
said many times.
Mm-hmm.
It just happened to be about archaeologists rather than police officers and forensics.
Mm-hmm.
And there are one other point I think I'd make before we wind up, and that is there are storylines which, in some respects, support the thesis, which they don't go into because it's not based on these documents.
Right.
One of those, one of the most interesting of those, is the character of Perkin Warbeck,
Mm.
who again claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, Richard IV, who travelled around the courts of Europe in the 1490s, supported by the Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy. He went to Scotland to visit the Scottish court, was actually and was actually married to a very senior Scottish noblewoman
Mm.
called Lady Catherine Gordon.
Mm. Mm.
And their story actually became the subject of a play by a younger contemporary of Shakespeare's called John Ford.
Right.
And it's sort of ambiguous about his character. It plays the political game of the character of Henry VII talks about, that this is a pretender and all the rest of it, and the dead princes. But the character of Perkin Warbeck is a noble one.
Mm.
And the relationship with Catherine is a genuine love story.
Mm.
She has one of the finest speeches in Jacobean theatre. So culturally, this stuff is going on, and there's always that thing nagging at the back of mind. You can't prove Perkin Warbeck wasn't Richard of York, Richard IV.
No, and I suppose one thing that they do point out in the documentary is it's interesting that in Warbeck's treatment while in prison, he wasn't forced to separate from this Scottish noblewoman.
Mm.
His marriage wasn't annulled, and seemingly
No,
she didn't protest it. So
no.
that's another weird little thing
And,
that
and, and, and in fact, in real life, after he was executed, she became a lady in waiting to Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's
right,
wife, and
right,
Richard's sister.
yeah. So she was one of the family.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. So again, there are these little interesting little things, and I'm very intrigued by the whole story, and I was very open to whatever conclusion might come. I think, as ever, though, what sometimes slightly sours things for me is the need to present uh, present things as being more conclusive than they might be.
Yeah.
To be fair, this documentary does end on a "you make up your mind now" kind of note, probably to cover its bases in terms of any potential future discoveries or maybe even legal challenges. Who knows? But and Rinder himself would have been very aware of potential legal stuff as well in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it does a good job of presenting the balance. But I suppose one final word on Philippa, and this is something that I think archaeologists and historians are always going to be curious about, is how do you think she comes across in the documentary? Shall I answer that for my point? My
You
part
answer that for
first.
yourself, and then
Yeah.
I've got my own thoughts on that, which I'll share in a moment if you like.
Okay. Well, this feeds into my observations about the finale. Actually, or this comes from those observations. It's filmed in a very claustrophobic way. It's kind of, almost chin and forehead cut off on the frame. Both Langley and Rinder in a conference room, presumably in his
Chambers.
legal chambers,
Yeah.
and he's going through his notes. He presents it in that slightly game showy way, and the answer is, and there's like a protracted, presumably edited silence, and then he suggests what he thinks about it, especially certain points of authenticity, etc., etc. Now, she goes to a coffee shop. She comes to the legal chambers, and then she whispers to herself like, "Okay, here we go," that kind of thing. She's so passionate and so caught up in this question as to whether or not the boy survived, that I would say that she still comes across as very close to the topic, shall we say. And this is kind of what I was getting at when we talked about the Lost King movie. You could describe it as passionate. You could, as Nicolas Cage says in National Treasure, one step short of crazy passionate. In that sense, this notion of the relationship between passion and almost inappropriate fervor can be dangerously close. And I think she's probably mellowed over the years. She seems to be a little less personally invested in Richard. Maybe that's because she did do that discovery, and then job was done in the first count. But I still feel as though it doesn't do her case any favors as an objective presentation, that she is clearly so invested in demonstrating that her Richard, her king, Richard III, her good guy, was a good guy in every aspect of his life, or every key aspect of his life, I should say. And therefore, I think it falls flat at that hurdle. But then again, what can you do about that? She can't. Well, she could have got someone else to present her findings, but that wouldn't be as compelling. People want to hear from the woman who, as Rinder says, potentially is someone for whom lightning strikes twice. So I get it. But also I feel as though sometimes she is her own worst enemy when it comes to the presentation of historical facts. I also find myself wondering, on one last point, how the rest of the Ricardian community views her, because she is presented, especially within the UK, as being the head of many researchers, your army of researchers, your team, so on and so forth. So I'm curious about that stuff. I have no conclusions because I don't know the woman personally, and I haven't looked into their community personally. But it does lead me to wonder whether at times her passion undermines her case. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I go back to the fact that it's an authored documentary. At least it's seen through the eyes of Philippa Langley, Philippa Langley's quest, and Philippa Langley's quest to prove. What I will say about the documentary is that they spent some money on it. It's an hour and a half. There's a lot of good location filming, drone, some really nice drone footage of medieval palaces in the Netherlands and things like that.
And of course, these days, being a roving film crew comes with expense as well in Europe. You can't just cross borders.
Yeah, it was a serious commitment to making a lamb. In scheduling terms, it was a landmark. It was a documentary made for prime time and sale abroad, particularly to the States. And they put the money on the screen. There's also, I don't know what you feel, but I thought that there's some very nice linking animations when they're telling the historical story at the beginning of the.
Yeah, well, actually, I specifically this morning filmed the screen to demonstrate this, and they'll be on screen now while we're talking about it. The animation style that they used, I thought, was excellent. It was like a sketch with little splashes of color, and in that sense, I think it communicated a sense of storytelling, of presenting potential counterfactual, potential history in a way that was quite light touch. They didn't get lookalikes to act out this stuff. In terms of actors, they decided to present it as sketches on parchment, and I thought that was quite clever, actually.
Death by cheap reenactment, I call that.
Well, death by cheap reenactment, but also I think you could argue that could be cheaper than, you know, hiring a room and getting some actors. It could be cheaper than actually hiring animators to do all that work.
Oh no, that's
I
the
think,
point I'm making. You know, the fact they went for the animation shows, you know, it was a classy product, but they put money on the screen.
Well, and
Absolutely.
I think arguably the intent behind it is to show that these are ideas that people are exploring, as opposed to it being, you know, this definitely happened, you know, regardless of what Philip or anyone else in the documentary says. Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, in the end, I'm not going to take a position on the Princes in the Tower. It's not my field. It's a fabulous mystery. It's why films like this still get made. Because, you know, unless and until that urn in Westminster Abbey gets opened and the DNA work is done, or the two mysterious bodies that are in the Edward IV's vault in the Royal Chapel at Windsor are, you know, properly investigated, rather than just assumptions are made about them. So, you know, there is potential more physical anthropological evidence out there. But as you said quite rightly at the get-go, and until that work's done and those bones are shown to be genetically related both to each other and to Richard III, arguments like this are still wide open. And you know, it's and, you know, long may it be so. Again, who a lot of has been made of the sort of citizen historians aspect of this. Yes, citizen historians, you know, say actually historians out in communities who've got the time and the commitment to go and look in these archives and find these documents or re-find these documents, and they are doing the subject a service.
Well,
And the conclusions can be made by the conclusions that are made by other people aren't their fault.
No, and it's clear as well that for example, the Dutch historian, the Dutch archivist, the Dutch researcher who went into the archive. There was a Dutch archivist there as well. I'm not talking about her. The researcher was a lawyer as well. These are serious people doing what they consider to be serious work. So, yeah, you've got to take that at face value. You absolutely have. Also, as well, I suppose one, I guess my final word on the whole thing would be this is yet another opportunity for archaeologists to learn about public communication.
Yes.
You know, as much as we know there's lots of furore around Langley, the Lost King movie in particular, there's still an academic, I believe, at Leicester a member of the admin team at Leicester who's threatening to sue the production company over his representation in the movie. These things are compelling and do get watched to the extent that they do. Because after all, as we've pointed out previously, The Lost King isn't the Avengers. Not everyone's going to watch the thing, but they are watched and they're presented in the way that they are because those formats do work and people actually sit down, plant themselves on their sofa, and keep eyes on for, in this case, close to an hour and a half. Because the format works, and so you know, you can have your questions about popular presentation of the past. You can have your questions about amateur history. But I think, as Sam Stein said in an interview that we filmed roughly this time last year, actually, if you want to be involved in this messaging and how these messages are crafted, then you need to get involved in the production and not necessarily in the aftermath. Because, as you pointed out earlier in this recording, they're not looking for peer review, folks. You know, it's done and dusted, and now it's up to the public to watch and to see what they think. Yeah,
and just to make the final point, you know, the documentary, I think, you know, whatever position you take, and you know, it's a well-made piece of TV. It's it's not one of those things you regret, you know, spending an hour and a half of your time on. It looks good. Yeah, there are times you might end up shouting at the screen or wanting to throw things at the screen, but at the same time, you've been engaged by it, even if it's provoked you.
Yeah,
and so
like all
worth
good
watching
art.
just on those. Yeah, absolutely. And just my final point, I'm looking at the Revealing Richard website at the moment, which talks about the which we'll link to, and it talks about the program and the evidence it discusses in detail. But I would just point out that in it they quote Philippa Langley as promising a phase 2 of the Missing Princes project, which is this current iteration, and she promises a phase 2, which includes looking for the actual resting places of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, possibly Richard IV, wherever they might be.
Intriguing. Okay. Watch this space, I guess. Speaking of watching, thank you guys for watching at home. Hopefully you've had a good time and hopefully you've had a good year. This will probably be published at some point betwixtmas, as it's called, or Twixtmas. So after Christmas Day, before the new year. Hopefully you're having a very merry time. I think both of us plan on having a relaxing time. As we record, in fact, Mrs. Soup and a friend of ours are doing the food shop for Christmas Day. And I'm going to do some final editing on a reading of Mabinogi, or part of the Mabinogi, to publish over the weekend. So we're winding up for Christmas. Merry Christmas to you, Andy. Happy holidays, or whatever other solar
Merry
festival.
Christmas to everybody else.
Yeah, indeed, my lord. I've got the headphones on. I can't just pull off the hat. But yeah, just have a great time, guys, and we'll see you soon. Not least for questionable archaeology. That's still in the works. We get to tie down the date, but at some point, hopefully before New Year, possibly just after, we'll see. Please do get your questions in. Details you can find on previous videos on this channel. And also, I'll put some details in the description below. Anyway, until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.